Hi, I'm Karen McCarthy, and it's time to Karen-ize. Today's Wednesday, that's when we talk about spiritual health, and I've been alluding to this topic for a few weeks now because I'm really excited to get into this. It's probably not going to be a topic that you think is going to be exciting, but it is such a critical topic, forgiveness. And it's not, biblical forgiveness is probably not what you think unless you've studied the biblical concepts of forgiveness in the Bible, which is, I guess, where the biblical things would be. It's one of those days. So we're going to get started on it, and we're going to study this for just a few weeks. Every week's going to have maybe a new facet or a different perspective, that type of thing, because it is so important. And when the Bible talks about forgiveness, it is one of the few things that God says there's a condition, and we'll get into that later. So I have to warn you, I cry very easily, and some of the stories are kind of tearjerkers. So if I get teary, I just got dog hair in my mouth. If I get teary, I'll try to keep talking. I'm not a good talker while I'm crying, so who knows. Anyway, I'm going to read you a story. This is a story called The Gift of Forgiveness, and it's by a man named John William Smith. Excuse me, I got a little frog today. Yep, a big frog. The Christmas of 1949, we didn't have a tree. Dad had as much pride as anybody, I suppose, so he wouldn't just say we couldn't afford one. When I mentioned it, my mother said we weren't going to have one this year, that we couldn't afford one, and even if we could, it was stupid to clutter up your house with a dead tree. I wanted a tree badly, though, and I thought in my naive way that if we had one, everybody would feel better. That's called taking matters into my own hands. About 3 days before Christmas, I was out collecting for my paper route. It was fairly late, long after dark, snowing and very cold. I went to an apartment building to try to catch a customer who hadn't paid me for nearly 2 months. She owed me $7. Much to my surprise, she was home. She invited me in, and not only did she pay me, she gave me $1 tip. Now, in 1949, that was a lot of money. It was a windfall for me. I now had $8 whole dollars. What happened next was totally unplanned. On the way home, I walked past a Christmas tree lot, and the idea hit me. The selection wasn't very good because it was so close to the holiday, but there was one really nice tree. It had been a very expensive tree, and no one had bought it. Now it was so close to Christmas that the man was afraid no one would. He wanted $10 for it, but when I, in my gullible innocence, told him I only had 8, he said he might sell it for that. I really didn't want to spend the whole $8 on the tree, but it was so pretty I finally agreed. I drug it all the way home, about a mile, I think, and I tried hard not to damage it or break off any limbs. The snow helped to cushion it, and it was still in pretty good shape when I got home. You can't imagine how proud and excited I was. I propped it up against the railing on our front porch and went in. My heart was bursting as I announced that I had a surprise. I got Mom and Dad to the door, and I switched on the porch light. Surprise! Where did you get that tree? My mother exclaimed, but it wasn't the kind of exclamation that indicates pleasure. I bought it up on Main Street. Isn't it the most perfect tree you've ever seen? I said, trying to maintain my enthusiasm. Where'd you get the money? Her tone was accusing, and it began to dawn on me that this was not going to turn out the way I had planned. From my paper route, I explained about the customer who had paid me. And you spent the whole $8 on this tree? She went into a tirade about how stupid it was to spend my money on a dumb tree that would be thrown out and burned in a few days. She told me how irresponsible I was, how I was just like my dad with all those foolish, romantic, noble notions about fairy tales and happy endings, and that it was about time I grew up and learned some sense about the realities of life and how to take care of money and spend it on things that we needed and not on silly things. She said I was going to end up in the poorhouse because I believe in stupid things like Christmas trees, things that didn't amount to anything. Boy, there's another whole lesson in this story, isn't there? I just stood there. My mother had never talked to me like that before, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I felt awful, and I began to cry. Finally, she reached out and snapped off the porch light. Leave it there, she said. Leave that tree there till it rots. So every time we see it, we'll all be reminded of how stupid the men in this family are. Then she stormed up the stairs to her bedroom, and we didn't see her until the next day. Dad and I brought the tree in, and we made a stand for it. He got out the box of ornaments, and we decorated as best we could. But men aren't too good at things like that, and besides, it wasn't the same without Mom. There were a few presents under it by Christmas Day, although I can't remember a single one of them. But Mom wouldn't have anything to do with it. It was the worst Christmas I ever had. Fast forward to today. Judy and I married in August of 1963, and Dad died on October 10th of that year. Over the next 8 years, we lived in many places. Mom sort of divided up the year, either living with my sister Jerry or with us. In 1971, we were living in Wichita, Kansas. Lincoln was about 7, Brendan was 3, and Kristen was a baby. My mom was staying with us during the holidays. On Christmas Eve, I stayed up very late. I was totally alone with my thoughts, alternating between joy and melancholy, and I got to thinking about my paper route, that tree, what my mother had said to me, and how Dad had tried to make things better. I heard a noise in the kitchen and discovered that it was Mom. She couldn't sleep either and had gotten up to make herself a cup of hot tea, which was her remedy for just about everything. As she waited for the water to boil, she walked into the living room and discovered me there. She saw my open Bible and asked what I was reading. When I told her, she asked if I would read it to her, and I did. The truth comes out. When the kettle began to whistle, she went and made her tea. She came back and we started to visit. I told her how happy I was that she was with us for Christmas and how I wished that Dad could have lived to see his grandchildren and to enjoy this time because he always loved Christmas so. It got very quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Here I go." Okay, this is take 4 because I keep crying. Get it together. I'm just going to summarize. Maybe it'll be easier. So she had been burdened with her behavior for 25 years, and she finally explained to him that she wished that his dad were here so she could tell him how sorry she was for what she said. She said he was a good man, and it hurts me to know he went to his grave without ever hearing me say I was sorry for that night. Nothing will ever make what I said right, but you need to know that your dad never did have money sense, which was all too true. We were fighting all the time, though not in front of you. We were 2 months behind in our house payments. We had no money for groceries. Your dad was talking about going back to Arkansas, and that tree was the last straw. I took it all out on you. It doesn't make what I did right, but I hoped that someday, when you were older, you would understand. I've wanted to say something for ever so long, and I'm so glad it's finally out. Well, we both cried a little and held each other, and I forgave her. It wasn't hard, you know. Then we talked for a long time, and I did understand. I saw... Just a second here. This is why I can't get up and talk in front of people. Then we talked for a long time, and I did understand. I saw what I had never seen, and the bitterness and sadness that had gathered up in me for all those years gradually washed away. It was marvelously simple. Now, I think, excuse me, I think one of the reasons it's hitting me so hard is that I grew up feeling like my mom didn't love me, didn't care. Well, I mean, didn't care, but didn't really love me, especially not as much as she loved my brothers. The way she treated me was not always great. I mean, I wasn't horribly abused or anything, but I just grew up with a lack of confidence because I just didn't feel my mother's love until I was staying with my grandmother once, and she told me some things about my mom's past that I did not know. She had been ripped away. She and her brother had been ripped away from my grandmother and raised in her father's home. Excuse me, I got another dog here. And they were very, he and his mother and his sister were very abusive to them. And once I understood all the things that had gone on, and I didn't even know all of them then, I knew more later. But once I knew that that's what had happened to her, it put everything that I had experienced in a whole new perspective. And it was like this weight had just fallen off of me. It was amazing. Oh, God. I had to get myself back together again. So that's why it's so important to talk about forgiveness. We don't always understand things like I was able to, but it's super important. So please, please keep watching. I made some notes. The greatest gifts of any season, I mean, this is kind of a Christmas story, but of any season, can't be put under the tree. You can't wear them, eat them, drive them, play with them. We spend a lot of time on these kind of gifts when really the biggest gifts of all, understanding, grace, peace, forgiveness, are what is important. It's what fills the empty spots in our hearts. And they're like the one greatest gift of all, and that is the gift that began back in Bethlehem of Judea, that very first Christmas. You can't buy them. They're not on a shopping list. They come as Jesus came, quietly, freely, unexpectedly. And if you're not careful, you'll miss them entirely. So I often hear stories of families torn apart by events that have destroyed relationships like that story. What a burden to bear that resentment, bitterness, and even hate. The Bible speaks so often about the importance of forgiveness. Unforgiveness has so many ramifications, including depression and even physical illness. Some studies have said that they can trace the root of many diseases back to unforgiveness, that what it does to our body, to hold on to that. God's commands for us to forgive are in large part because he knows how destructive unforgiveness is. Ephesians 4:32 says, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you." I don't know about you, but when I think of all that God has forgiven me for, I mean, my life has been a mess. I have made all kinds of mistakes. Crazy. I know I have no right to hold anything against anyone else. Besides the negative effects of holding on to that anger and resentment, no matter how well-deserved it is, I think it would be very presumptuous of me to say that I won't forgive someone, knowing the forgiveness he's extended to me. So out of respect and love for him, I choose to forgive anyone who has or ever will do me wrong. So let's begin to think about forgiveness over the next few weeks. With unforgiveness in our hearts, we're limiting ourselves from that true abundant life that Jesus promised to us in him. But more on that later. So I think I've covered it. I do want to read a little, and it's very little. It says, "Forgiveness does not always lead to a healed relationship. Some people just aren't capable of love and can be toxic to our lives. Sometimes we have to set up boundaries to protect ourselves. Wish them well, pray for them, and take care of yourself." And we'll go into that a little bit more, but I just wanted to leave you with this. Forgiveness doesn't always, it doesn't mean that what they did was right. What they did was okay. And we'll find out what it really does mean. So I'll talk to you next week, and hopefully I won't cry as much. See you then. Bye.